an elderly woman finds an abandoned baby near a dumpster. She takes the child home, and what she discovers years later is astonishing. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. Margaret had lived a quiet, solitary life for years. At 72, she found comfort in routine, often taking morning walks through the narrow, tree-lined streets of her small neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle. She had always been a woman of resilience, having survived the loss of her husband years earlier, and now spent her days alone in her modest home, filled with memories and echoes of a life once shared. On this particular morning, the air was crisp, the sun barely peeking through the gray clouds above. Margaret's breath formed small puffs of mist as she walked. The silence of the neighborhood was familiar and comforting, until it was interrupted by a sound so faint that, at first, she thought she had imagined it. A soft, almost imperceptible cry. She stopped, her heart quickening, and turned her head toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the direction of the alleyway near an old rusted dumpster where only stray cats usually lingered. Curiosity and concern overtook her as she slowly approached. The closer she got, the more distinct the sound became. A baby's cry, delicate and weak. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She quickened her pace, her legs trembling slightly as fear and adrenaline rushed through her. She reached the dumpster, its metal surface worn and weathered by time, and peered behind it. There, nestled in a pile of discarded newspapers and scraps, was a tiny baby, wrapped loosely in a thin, tattered blanket. The baby's face was red from crying, small fists clenched as it squirmed, desperate for warmth and comfort. The sight was utterly heartbreaking. Margaret knelt down, her hands shaking as she reached out, gently touching the blanket to confirm that what she was seeing was real. Her heart ached. She couldn't fathom how anyone could leave a baby in such a place, alone, cold and vulnerable. The baby's cries grew louder as Margaret's hand hovered above it, the warmth of her presence seeming to soothe it ever so slightly. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. Now was not the time for emotion to cloud her judgment. She needed to think clearly, to act with urgency. Margaret looked around, her eyes scanning the deserted alley. No one was there, no clues as to who might have left the child. Her mind raced with questions, but she pushed them aside for the moment. All that mattered was the helpless little soul in front of her. Margaret stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, her mind spinning with uncertainty. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her hands trembling as she held the frayed edge of the baby's blanket. The enormity of the situation weighed heavily on her. What could a woman like her, a widow in her 70s living alone, possibly offer to a tiny infant? She wasn't sure she had the strength for this, and the questions gnawed at her. Who had abandoned this child? Was there someone looking for him? But the more she stood there, listening to the baby's faint cries, the less these questions seemed to matter. She knelt again, leaning closer to the infant, and the baby's tiny eyes fluttered open. For a brief moment, Margaret's hesitation melted away. The child's helplessness triggered something deep within her, a long-dormant instinct she hadn't felt since her own children were young. Her fingers brushed the baby's cheek gently, and she felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness and compassion rise within her, cutting through her uncertainty. She couldn't just leave the child here. The cold, the loneliness, the danger of this unforgiving world. No, she could not walk away, not when this life was in her hands. In that instant, her doubts faded. She wrapped the baby more securely in the tattered blanket and lifted him carefully into her arms. Despite her frail frame, she felt a strange, almost fierce strength as she cradled the child close to her chest, the warmth of his small body radiating through her. The baby quieted almost instantly, its sobs subsiding into soft, rhythmic breaths as it nestled against Margaret. She whispered soothingly, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for the child or for herself. "It's going to be all right. I've got you now." The streets were still empty, the early morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. Her mind raced ahead, contemplating what lay ahead for her and this child. She had no supplies, no crib, no bottles. She didn't even know how to care for a baby anymore. But none of that mattered at this moment. The only thing she knew with certainty was that she couldn't let this child out of her sight. As she reached her front door and stepped inside, the warmth of her home greeted her. Margaret looked down at the baby in her arms, who had finally fallen asleep, and in that moment, she made a quiet promise. Whatever challenges came, she would face them. Whatever sacrifices were required, she would make them. This child, this small, fragile being, had given her something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. And from that sense of purpose, she found the strength to do what needed to be done. She glanced at the baby again, now peaceful in her arms. "Ethan," she whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as if she had known it all along. "I'll call you Ethan." Caring for a baby was far more challenging than Margaret had anticipated. Her body, once strong and capable, now felt the strain of sleepless nights, frequent feedings, and constant vigilance. She hadn't had to care for an infant in decades, and her hands, once so sure, were now slower and less steady. Simple tasks, like changing diapers or rocking Ethan to sleep, left her exhausted. Some days her joints ached so much that she struggled just to get out of bed, yet somehow, each morning, she found the strength to rise again. What drove her forward was the love that blossomed within her, a love that grew stronger with every passing day. Ethan had an innocence that reminded her of all the good still left in the world, and his laughter was like a balm for the loneliness that had once consumed her. Margaret's once quiet and monotonous existence was now filled with the sounds of coos, giggles, and the occasional outburst of crying. The house, which had felt so empty, was now alive with the presence of this tiny, fragile being. There were moments when Margaret doubted herself, moments when she feared she wasn't up to the task of raising a baby at her age. But those doubts were always overshadowed by the way Ethan looked at her with his bright, trusting eyes. His tiny hands would reach for her in the middle of the night, and when she held him close, all of her fears seemed to fade away. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. Her heart, which had felt heavy with the weight of years of solitude, now beat with renewed purpose. The small details of caring for Ethan became the moments Margaret treasured most. His first smiles, the way his hand would curl around her finger, the soft weight of his body as he slept in her arms. These were the things that made the sleepless nights and physical aches worth it. The bond between them deepened with every passing day, and Margaret began to realize that, despite her age, she was exactly what Ethan needed. Perhaps in some ways, he was what she needed too. Her days were no longer filled with the lonely routines of her past. Instead, they were punctuated by new rhythms, bottle feedings, lullabies, and moments of quiet, when she would sit in her old rocking chair, Ethan resting peacefully against her chest. The house, once still and quiet, now pulsed with life. Even the small, mundane tasks of daily life, laundry, cleaning, cooking, took on a different meaning with Ethan there. Margaret found herself thinking less about the past and more about the future. She no longer felt the weight of years gone by pressing down on her. Instead, she looked forward to each new day with a sense of hope and possibility she hadn't felt in years. Ethan had changed everything. She no longer moved through life like a shadow of herself. She was living fully, with all the joy and heartache that came with it. As Margaret sat in her rocking chair one evening, with Ethan sleeping soundly in her arms, she realized that this was the life she had never known she needed. The simple warmth of his presence had reignited something within her that she had thought was lost forever. And in caring for Ethan, she was, in some way, healing herself. The years passed like chapters in a well-worn book, and under Margaret's care, Ethan flourished. His babyhood faded into memory, replaced by the rapid growth of childhood. From the first wobbly steps he took across the creaky wooden floors of their small home to the burst of laughter that echoed through the halls as he played with the old, worn-out toys Margaret had kept from her own children, Ethan filled their home with joy and light. Margaret watched with wonder as he grew, his once tiny limbs growing strong, his babbling turning into words and then into full sentences. Ethan was a curious child, always asking questions about the world around him. His eyes sparkled with the kind of curiosity that only children possess, constantly observing, exploring, and discovering. He would spend hours in the small garden Margaret tended to, chasing butterflies or helping her water the plants, his small hands covered in dirt and his face lit up with a wide grin. Despite the simplicity of their lives, Margaret did everything she could to make sure Ethan had a childhood filled with love and warmth. She took him on long walks through the nearby woods, teaching him about the trees and birds, and they would collect pine cones and stones along the way. On rainy days, they would sit together by the window, Margaret with her knitting, Ethan curled up with a stack of picture books. His questions were endless, his fascination with stories, and the world beyond their small home growing with each passing day. There were no grand gestures, no lavish toys or expensive vacations. Instead, their life was defined by the small moments that Margaret had come to treasure, like the way Ethan would snuggle up beside her as she read him a bedtime story, or how his laughter would fill the air when they played hide-and-seek around the house. Ethan's happiness was Margaret's greatest reward, and though her body continued to grow weaker with age, her spirit felt renewed every time she saw his bright, smiling face. Ethan wasn't just strong physically, his heart was equally as big. He was kind to the neighbors, often helping them with small tasks like carrying groceries or tending to their gardens. He would run errands for Margaret, always eager to assist in any way he could, even at a young age. His nature was gentle, his demeanor calm yet lively, and Margaret couldn't help but marvel at how such a sweet soul had come into her life from such mysterious and tragic beginnings. But there were times when she would catch herself staring at him, her thoughts drifting back to that cold morning when she had found him abandoned and alone. How could such a beautiful, loving child have been left in that state? Margaret pushed these thoughts aside whenever they crept in, reminding herself that they had built something precious together, something more valuable than any unanswered question. Their life together was not one of luxury, but it was full of love and care, the kind that made even the simplest moments feel special. Margaret found herself cherishing every day they spent together, knowing that raising Ethan had given her life a purpose she hadn't realized she needed. And so, the bond between Margaret and Ethan grew stronger with each passing year, each smile, each shared laugh. Ethan had become her world and she his, and Margaret's days with Ethan were filled with love, laughter, and the kind of warmth she had long thought was lost to her. Yet, even in the midst of their contented life, a shadow lingered quietly at the back of her mind, a question she could never shake. It was a question that had been with her from the very beginning, from the moment she first cradled that tiny, abandoned baby in her arms. Who had left Ethan behind? And perhaps more hauntingly, why? Each time Margaret looked at Ethan, now a growing boy with boundless energy and a heart as kind as any she had known, those thoughts would surface, unbidden. She would catch herself staring at him during quiet moments, watching the way he concentrated on a drawing, or the way his brow furrowed with curiosity when he asked one of his endless questions. How could a child so full of life and promise have been left so callously behind? She had never found any answers, and the mystery gnawed at her, even if she didn't want to admit it. Margaret had avoided thinking about it for years, focusing instead on the present, the life they had built together. But as Ethan grew older, the worry became harder to ignore. What would she say to him when he inevitably began to ask about where he came from? Children always ask these questions eventually, and Margaret knew the day would come when Ethan would want to know the truth. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she tell him that the people who should have loved him the most had abandoned him like refuse? The thought made her heart ache, and yet she knew she couldn't keep these questions from him forever. She had always prided herself on being honest with Ethan, never hiding the difficulties of life from him, no matter how hard they might be. But this was different. This was something she didn't even know how to approach. At night, when the house grew quiet and Ethan was asleep, Margaret would find herself lying awake, her mind restless with thoughts of the past. She would wonder about the person or people who had left Ethan behind. Were they still out there somewhere, living their lives as if nothing had happened? Did they ever think about him, or did they believe that part of their lives was over? And what kind of life would Ethan have had if she hadn't found him that morning? Sometimes the weight of it all felt unbearable, but Margaret carried it in silence, not wanting to burden Ethan with her fears. She loved him too much to let the uncertainty of his origins taint the happiness they had created together. But that nagging fear remained, a quiet but constant hum in the background of her thoughts. As much as she wanted to protect him from the pain of his past, she knew that one day the questions would have to be answered. And when that day came, Margaret feared that everything they had built together might come crashing down around them. One crisp afternoon, with the sunlight streaming in through the lace curtains of her small living room, Margaret decided to clean out some old boxes that had been tucked away in the attic for years. It was something she had been meaning to do for a while, but life had a way of pulling her attention in other directions, mostly toward Ethan, who always seemed to need her for something, whether it was a scraped knee, or help with his schoolwork. But now, with Ethan at a friend's house for the afternoon, Margaret found herself with time and space to sift through her past. She moved slowly, her hands touching old photographs, mementos of her life with her late husband, and the many small tokens of her children's childhoods. Each item brought back a rush of memories, but there was one box in particular that drew her focus. It was small, wooden, and tucked away in the far corner of the attic, covered in a thin layer of dust. Margaret opened the box, and inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was the old blanket Ethan had been swaddled in when she found him. She had kept it all these years, never able to bring herself to throw it away. The fabric was worn and thin from age, but it still held a certain weight in her heart. Gently, she unfolded the blanket, running her fingers over the soft material. When something cold and metallic brushed against her skin, her brow furrowed in confusion. She hadn't remembered anything being wrapped in the blanket besides Ethan. Carefully, she turned the blanket over, and there, tangled in the fabric, was a small bracelet. It was delicate, made of fine gold, and had clearly been there for a long time, though Margaret had somehow missed it all those years ago. She held the bracelet up to the light, her eyes narrowing as she examined it more closely. It was finely crafted, with an intricate design etched into the surface, some kind of symbol she didn't recognize. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she realized the importance of what she was holding. How had she missed this before? Could it be a clue, a piece of the puzzle that might help explain where Ethan had come from? The bracelet felt impossibly light in her hands, yet its presence carried a weight that Margaret couldn't ignore. She stared at the symbol, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this a family crest? A personal emblem? Who could have left this with Ethan and why? The questions that had always haunted her now felt even more pressing, the mystery of Ethan's origins deepening with every passing moment. Margaret placed the bracelet back on the table in front of her, her hands trembling slightly. She couldn't stop staring at it, as if it might reveal its secrets if she looked hard enough. The symbol remained unfamiliar, though it tugged at something deep within her, a sense of importance she couldn't quite explain. She had always known that Ethan's abandonment was tied to something much bigger than she could understand. And now, with this discovery, it felt as though she had stumbled upon a key, one that could unlock the answers she had been seeking for so many years. Margaret stared at the bracelet for days, her thoughts a tangled web of worry and curiosity. The symbol carved into the gold haunted her. Its elegance and precision hinted at a past far removed from their simple life. She couldn't shake the feeling that this bracelet held answers, but she knew she couldn't uncover them alone. After much consideration, Margaret decided to reach out to someone from her past, someone who might be able to help her unravel this mystery. James had been a close friend in her younger years. They had shared moments of adventure and mischief in their youth before life had pulled them in different directions. James had gone on to become an investigator, spending years tracking down missing persons, unraveling secrets, and piecing together the stories others had left behind. Though they hadn't spoken in years, Margaret knew that if anyone could help her, it would be James. She hesitated before picking up the phone, unsure of how to begin such a conversation after so long. But once his voice came through the line, warm and familiar despite the years, Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders. After some small talk, she told him about the bracelet, the symbol, and the baby she had found all those years ago. James listened in silence as Margaret recounted the events, his sharp mind already working through the details she provided. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke with a tone of seriousness she hadn't expected. "Margaret," James said carefully, "I can help you, but you need to understand that what we might uncover could be complicated. Sometimes the past isn't what we want it to be." "I need to know, James," she replied softly. "I've lived with this mystery for too long. Whatever the truth is, I need to face it." Margaret could hear the wheels turning in his mind as he considered the leads, the resources he would need, and the steps to take next. Though his voice remained calm, Margaret could sense his own curiosity growing. This was no ordinary case, and James knew it. Before they hung up, James repeated his warning. "Whatever I find, Margaret, it might not be what you expect. Be ready for that." She tried to occupy herself with her daily routines, but the silence weighed heavily on her. Every time the phone rang, her heart would skip a beat, wondering if this would be the call that would change everything. And one afternoon, That call finally came. James's voice on the other end of the line was steady, but Margaret could sense the gravity in his words. "Margaret, I found something," he began, his tone more serious than she had ever heard. She held her breath, listening intently as he unraveled the details of what he had uncovered. The bracelet, James explained, was no ordinary trinket. The symbol engraved on it belonged to one of the most powerful families in the country, the Montgomerys. Known for their vast wealth and influence, the Montgomery family had built an empire that spanned multiple industries: finance, real estate, and philanthropy. They were a household name in high society, their influence stretching from the boardrooms of New York to the political circles of Washington. But it wasn't just their wealth that set them apart. The Montgomery family had always maintained a carefully curated image of prestige and perfection. Scandals rarely touched them, and when they did, they were swiftly buried beneath layers of power and money. The bracelet Margaret had found with Ethan was not just a clue, it was a direct link to this world of unimaginable luxury and untold secrets. James had dug deep into their history, and the deeper he went, the more complex the story became. Ethan, it seemed, was no ordinary abandoned child. All signs pointed to him being a legitimate heir to the Montgomery fortune. His abandonment, however, was shrouded in mystery. There were no records of a missing Montgomery child, no public scandal or tragedy that would explain how Ethan had ended up in that alley, alone and forgotten. The more James uncovered, the clearer it became that someone had gone to great lengths to hide Ethan's existence. There were whispers of internal family conflicts, power struggles, and even dark rumors of secrets buried deep within the Montgomery legacy. Yet nothing concrete emerged to explain why Ethan had been cast aside, left to the mercy of fate. "The Montgomerys," James said, his voice dropping as if to shield them both from the weight of the truth. "They're not a family to be trifled with. Whatever happened, Margaret, it wasn't by accident. Someone wanted that boy hidden, someone powerful. The boy she had raised, the child she had loved as her own, was entangled in a world so far removed from their simple existence. The thought of it was overwhelming, yet she couldn't stop listening, couldn't stop trying to piece together this puzzle that had suddenly become her reality." James's voice softened as he sensed her unease. "Margaret, I don't know who abandoned him or why they did it, but I do know this. Ethan's connection to the Montgomerys could change everything. And whatever their reasons, someone will want to keep this hidden." The weight of James's revelations bore down on her like a heavy fog, suffocating the peace she had worked so hard to build. She had known, deep down, that Ethan's origins were tied to something bigger than she could comprehend, but hearing it confirmed, the wealth, the power, the dark secrecy of the Montgomery family, made it all too real. She felt as though her world, the simple life she had cherished with Ethan, was teetering on the edge of something she could not control. The truth haunted her. How could she reconcile the boy she had raised, sweet, kind-hearted Ethan, with the world of affluence and manipulation that James had uncovered? She feared that the luxuries and pressures of that life would swallow him whole, taking away the innocence she had worked so hard to preserve. Margaret had seen firsthand how wealth could corrupt, how power could twist people into shadows of their former selves, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing Ethan to that world. Her mind churned with painful memories. Her own experiences with loss, the people she had watched change over the years as money and status consumed them. Ethan had been her second chance at love, at family. He had brought life back into her world, a world that had felt empty and dark before his arrival. The thought of losing him, of having him taken away from her, felt like a deep wound being reopened, one that she wasn't sure she could survive. But alongside the fear was another truth she couldn't ignore. Ethan had the right to know who he really was. As much as she wanted to shield him from the harsh realities of his past, she knew she couldn't keep the truth from him forever. She had always prided herself on being honest with him, and this secret, this shadow hanging over their lives, would eventually need to come to light. Yet how could she possibly explain this to him? He was just 10 years old, still so young, still so unaware of the complexities of the world. How could she burden him with something so heavy, so tangled in secrets and betrayal? Margaret's heart ached with the knowledge that, no matter how carefully she handled it, this truth would change everything. It would reshape their lives in ways she couldn't fully predict. She had always imagined Ethan growing up in their quiet little town, perhaps going off to college one day, but always coming back to visit her, to the home where he had grown up, the life they had shared. Now, that future seemed uncertain. The Montgomery name carried weight, and with it, expectations that would pull him in a direction Margaret could barely comprehend. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, resting her elbows on her knees as she buried her face in her hands. The weight of the decision before her felt unbearable. She knew that if she told Ethan the truth, it would open the door to a world that might one day take him away from her. But if she kept the secret, she risked betraying the very trust she had worked so hard to build. The past was no longer something she could hide from. It had returned, as powerful and inevitable as the tides, and it demanded to be faced. Margaret had been restless for days, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest like a boulder she could no longer ignore. The thought of sharing Ethan's past with him had kept her up at night, her mind endlessly replaying the conversation she knew she had to have. But no matter how much she rehearsed it in her head, it never felt like the right time. She would look at him, his carefree smile, his bright eyes full of innocence, and the words would catch in her throat. How could she risk shattering that innocence? But Margaret knew the truth couldn't be avoided forever. And so, one late afternoon, when the golden light of the setting sun bathed their small living room in warmth, she made the decision. She called Ethan to sit with her on the couch, and with a trembling heart she began to speak. Her voice wavered as she told him about the morning she had found him, how he had been wrapped in a thin blanket and left alone. She described the bracelet she had found, the one that had led to the discovery of his connection to the powerful Montgomery family. Ethan sat quietly beside her, his expression unreadable as he listened. Margaret couldn't tell if he was understanding the gravity of what she was saying, or if it was simply too much for his young mind to process. Her heart ached as she continued, explaining as gently as she could that his life had begun in a world far different from the one he knew now, a world of wealth, power, and secrets. When she finished speaking, there was a long silence between them. Margaret waited, her breath held, unsure of what Ethan would say or do. She feared the confusion, the hurt that would inevitably come. She had prepared herself for tears, for anger, for a reaction that might tear at the bond they had built over the years. But to her surprise, Ethan reached for her hand. His grip was strong and steady, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw not confusion or resentment, but a quiet determination. "Does this mean I'm not really your son?" he asked, his voice soft but calm. Margaret's heart twisted at the question, but she answered truthfully. "By blood, no," she said, her voice shaking. "But in every other way that matters, Ethan. You are mine. You are my son. Nothing will ever change that." He leaned in and wrapped his arms around her in a tight embrace, resting his head against her shoulder. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat as she hugged him back, tears brimming in her eyes. "You're my family," he whispered. "You've always been my family. I don't care about the Montgomerys. I just want to stay with you." The revelation of his past hadn't changed that. They sat together in the fading light of the day, their embrace lingering as the weight of the truth settled into their lives. Ethan's acceptance of his past, and his choice to remain with her, filled Margaret with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. For now, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. Months had passed since Margaret had revealed the truth to Ethan, and though life had settled into its familiar rhythm, a sense of unease lingered in the background. She had known that telling Ethan the truth might set into motion forces beyond her control. And sure enough, the news of Ethan's survival had eventually reached the Montgomery family. The day Margaret had dreaded came unexpectedly. A sleek black car pulled up in front of her modest home one cool morning. Its polished exterior, a stark contrast to the worn, quiet streets of their neighborhood. Margaret stood at the window, watching as two figures stepped out, dressed in fine clothing, their presence radiating an air of wealth and authority. Her heart raced as she realized who they must be. The Montgomerys had come. Her first instinct was to protect Ethan, to shield him from whatever was about to happen. She had feared this moment for months, imagining all the ways they might try to take him away from her. She feared their power, their influence, things she could never compete with. But as she opened the door and greeted them, she was met not with hostility, but with something unexpected, warmth and gratitude. The Montgomerys introduced themselves as Catherine and William, distant relatives of Ethan. Their expressions were serious but kind, and as they entered Margaret's home, They expressed their deep appreciation for what she had done. They had only recently discovered Ethan's existence, they explained, and had been desperate to find him ever since. For years they had believed him lost, perhaps even gone forever, and yet here he was, alive and well, thanks to Margaret's care. Margaret listened in stunned silence as they spoke. They weren't angry, nor were they here to tear him away from her. Instead, Catherine, her voice trembling with emotion, reached for Margaret's hands. "We cannot begin to thank you enough for what you've done," Catherine said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You gave Ethan a life we could not. You loved him when we couldn't find him. For that, we are forever grateful." She had expected resistance, perhaps a battle to keep Ethan, but instead, the Montgomerys were offering something entirely different. They had no intention of uprooting him or separating him from the only life he had ever known. Instead, they wanted to offer their support, to be a part of Ethan's life, but only if Margaret allowed it. It was a surreal moment, one Margaret had never anticipated. Here were two people who had every right to claim Ethan as their own, and yet they were deferring to her, recognizing her as the one who had saved him, who had raised him. The tension in Margaret's chest began to ease as she realized that this encounter was not a confrontation, but the beginning of something new. Ethan stood in the background, watching the exchange with wide eyes. He had known about the Montgomery family for months now, but seeing them in person made it all feel real in a way it hadn't before. Yet despite the sudden intrusion of this new reality, Ethan remained close to Margaret's side, his small hand clutching hers as the Montgomerys spoke. "We're not here to disrupt your life," William added, his voice calm and sincere. "We only want to help. Whatever Ethan needs, whatever you need, we're here." She had protected Ethan from the world for so many years, but now it seemed that perhaps this new chapter didn't have to be as frightening as she had imagined. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers in front of her with tears welling in her eyes. The Montgomerys had returned with a proposition she never could have anticipated, a proposal so generous, so unexpected, that she had to take a moment to fully absorb it. They had seen the bond between her and Ethan, had recognized the love that existed between them, and instead of trying to impose their wealth and power, they chose to honor that connection. They didn't want to take Ethan away. They wanted to protect it. What they offered was beyond anything Margaret had ever imagined. They proposed that Margaret become Ethan's legal guardian, with their full support. They would provide everything she and Ethan needed: financial security, educational opportunities for Ethan, health care, a stable future. All of it, without breaking the family that had already been formed. For years, Margaret had lived with the constant fear that one day, Ethan would be taken from her. But now, with the Montgomerys extending this olive branch, offering not just financial help but a true partnership, she felt a mix of emotions that she hadn't expected. Relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of disbelief. She had raised Ethan with nothing but her love and resilience. Now it seemed, all of that would be fortified by resources and support she could have never provided on her own. Catherine's words had been clear and heartfelt. "We don't want to tear Ethan away from the only home he's ever known. We want to build a future where he can have the best of both worlds. You've done more for him than anyone could have imagined, and we want to make sure you're both cared for." But as she sat with Ethan in her lap, holding his hand tightly, she realized that this was not an offer that would distance them. It was one that could secure their future. She would remain his mother in every way that mattered, and now she could give him opportunities that would have otherwise been out of reach. The official paperwork had been drawn up swiftly. The Montgomerys handled everything with care, ensuring that Margaret had all the time she needed to process the legal steps. They wanted her to feel safe, valued, and above all, respected. This wasn't just a transaction for them. It was a way to honor the life that Margaret had given Ethan. And so, with a steady hand, Margaret signed the papers. Tears slid down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of gratitude and hope. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of uncertainty lift from her shoulders. Ethan's future was secure, and their bond was preserved. As the months passed, Margaret's and Ethan's lives began to shift, but in ways that only enhanced the love and stability they had already shared. The Montgomerys kept their word, providing not just money but opportunities. Ethan began attending a better school. Margaret's home received much-needed repairs, and they even took the occasional trip to visit the Montgomery estate, where Ethan could learn about his heritage without losing himself in it. But through it all, their home remained the same. Margaret was still the woman who had raised him, and Ethan was still the boy who had found love and comfort in her arms. Their lives had expanded, not changed, and with that expansion came a peace that Margaret had never expected to feel. Margaret often marveled at the way life had unfolded, how the unexpected arrival of a baby at her doorstep had turned her world upside down, only for it to be righted in ways she could never have predicted. Ethan had given her purpose, and now, with the support of the Montgomerys, that purpose was stronger than ever. They were a family, bound not by blood but by choice, and in the end that bond was all that truly mattered.